Okay, we are live. Thank you for those of you who are joining us live on the Hangout. And today we're going to be exploring the great outdoors. We're going to be talking about nature photography as well as landscape photography. And we've got a great guest here today. And this webinar is brought to you by the folks over at Athentech, makers of Perfectly Clear. We'll be exploring their software a bit, but also sharing some general shooting advice. And joining us today is nature and landscape photographer Jason Hahn. So I'd like to welcome those of you who are joining us. And Jason, good morning or
Good
good
morning.
afternoon, depending upon where you're at. So thanks again for joining us. And Jason, can you give folks a little bit about your background with photography?
Yeah, sure. I've been a pretty much professional photographer for about 15 years now. The short story is I got into it thanks to bike rides with my son. We had just moved to Florida and everything down here was new. And I grew up on a farm. I've worked for zoos, state parks, all kinds of things. So nature was always part of my background, childhood. It's just always been a backdrop to everything I do. So as we got down here, I started seeing all these different birds and different trees, things that I had never seen before growing up in Maryland, and started carrying a camera with me and very quickly became addicted to the photography versus the bike rides. So ever since then, it's been full speed ahead, and very lucky to have what I think is one of the coolest jobs in the world. And I'm also very lucky that this is a family business. My wife is our business manager, and my son has been involved in pretty much every step of the way. Now he's a 16-year-old, a little less interested, and there's some other priorities right now. So, but yeah, it's a tremendous amount of fun.
Excellent. Well, today we're going to talk about the shooting aspects as well as some of the post-production aspects. And one of the things that I think is important to get out of the way is just some of the equipment needs that you find are essential. So I know that, landscapes and nature are a bit different. So why don't we start with landscape photography? Is there any equipment that you find is absolutely critical for your workflow to capture great landscapes?
Yeah, specifically with landscapes, and it's almost a cliche because you hear it so often, but a good tripod is absolutely key to good landscapes. Okay, when you think landscapes versus wildlife, other forms of photography, the way I put it to people is think proactive versus reactive. Okay, so a landscape, you are really envisioning the scene and you can really act before things unfold. So I know what time of day the sunrise is. I know what the weather forecast is going to be. I can really prepare myself versus wildlife where it's very reactive. So with landscapes, you're going to be shooting in low light. That tripod's really, really key. I don't use a tremendous amount of filters. Just have a few basic ones that I carry, but I do think a polarizer is absolutely vital for good landscape photography. As good as some of the software is, polarizers change things a bit in the field because of the nature of polarized light and how it's affecting a scene. And where you'll really see it is in water, obviously, and skies, but also in things that have shine to them, like leaves. And since trees are in a lot of our landscape pictures, the ability to change and really remove that polarized light or remove that shine from leaves allows the true colors to come through. So they're not going to appear washed out or actually have a color cast to them.
Now, a lot of times that polarizer is a circular polarizer and it needs to be rotated.
Yes.
How do you know what's right when you're shooting? I think a lot of folks attach it, but they don't realize that they're not done by just attaching it to the camera.
Yeah, the real, what you have to realize with the circular polarizers, if you look, probably the best way to think about it is that it's almost like if you have mini blinds in your house and you slightly open those blinds, light can pass through the slots. Okay, you're basically rotating this thing at 90-degree angles so that those lines are either straight up and down or straight side to side. So as you're rotating, what you want to do is look at areas in your image that are likely to be affected by polarized light. Anything wet, anything, typically blues and greens really affect. So if you're looking at the sky, look for what looks like a bruise on the sky. That's probably the best way to put it, and start rotating until that disappears. A lot of times, if I'm not sure, I'll rotate it a full 180 degrees. So just grab a hold of, let me put my hand up here properly. You want to just basically grab your filter like this and turn in 90-degree increments. Okay. Some filters will actually come with a mark on them. You'll see a little triangle, diamond, something like that, and that usually will serve as your point of reference. But the problem you'll run into is if you get off on that, places especially like Midwest or out in the West, like Moab, Utah, your sky will be half polarized, and it really will look purple on one side and blue on the other.
That makes sense. Now, once we get the polarizer correct and we're shooting with landscapes, people tend to fall into sort of two camps. Personally, I often favor, traditionally shooting a stitched panorama, and, I'm often doing really wide views. However, resolutions in cameras have gotten so high that, there's not necessarily a technical need for that. What do you find yourself doing most often? Are you shooting from a fixed position and doing longer exposures or anything in camera, with single exposures, or what's your general approach these days? Has it changed over time?
It has changed to a degree. I tend to look at a scene, always what story am I trying to tell? Okay. So if I'm trying to capture the vastness of a place and go, okay, this is huge and I want to share this, then yes, I would definitely be thinking more panoramic. To your point, I'm still of that traditional school as well of stitching things together. My first camera was 4 megapixels. So, that's what I learned was you don't crop 4 megapixels into a pano because you don't print that. So certainly I err on the side of stitching and working with it after the fact. That being said, there are certainly, now as cameras have changed, there are times where I may crop it, but really I'm a big believer in pre-visualization and seeing the shot before you take it. So if I'm envisioning a big panoramic, I'd rather do that then, and that's just going to give me a lot more to work with. One of the things I've found personally with landscapes is what I think looks great at the time sometimes doesn't necessarily hold up as much as some of my other subjects when I get back to the digital darkroom. By going with the big stitches and panos, you just have more real estate to work with, so that if what you envisioned isn't quite working afterwards, then you can certainly adjust that a bit. When it comes to landscapes, I'm also a big fan of the long lens landscape. So I'm a big believer in scale down and simplify the scene. Going back to the idea of being a storyteller, if the story you're trying to tell about this place can be accomplished with as little as possible in the scene. So look at what you're trying to capture in the scene and say, okay, are all the elements that I'm including in the frame right now actually helping tell that story, or are they distracting from it? One of the difficulties we get with these big landscapes is that, we're there, and every photographer story was, there I was up on the mountain and it was beautiful. That's all of our stories start with there I was. And that there I was moment, you have all the experiences from that. You saw the vastness, the 3D, 360-degree, wonderful world, the sounds, the smells. The person looking at the picture doesn't get that. They're going to have a very scaled down, two-dimensional, almost sterilized version of that. So if what you're trying to convey of the vastness, the majesty of the place does not translate to that two-dimensional format, that's where simplifying, scaling down to really focus the story. And that's where I think things like long lens landscapes, HDRs, those kinds of techniques come in to really home in on what the story of that moment is.
Well, Jason, why don't you open up a couple of your favorite landscapes, and we'll talk
Sure.
through some of the things that you see in the photo and how you took them. And I just wanted to remind folks, if you are in the chat pod, you can feel free to post comments over there on the YouTube side. Just click over to YouTube. There is a chat pod. And if you have any questions for Jason about his photography or some of the software techniques we're going to look at later, we'll be happy to cover those. And while Jason's getting some pictures opened up, just share your screen when you're ready, Jason. I'll actually just show one thing here really quick. Oh, he's already got one. So let's just switch over to him for a moment. So we're browsing through here. And I see what you mean there, Jason. You know, you're really focusing in sort of on the action there. And while it's not complete and vast, I still really get a sense of the environment. And I love the mist here. So
Thank
I imagine that this involved doing something that I'm not crazy about, of getting up at a certain time of day.
Well, if you look at my lower third of the screen, guy with muddy feet, yes, guy with muddy feet out at a very, very early part of the day. Yes. Typically for uh, this shot in particular, this is in the Everglades. This is my second home. I love it here. This is one of the most beautiful, complex, and misunderstood places on the planet. Everybody thinks the Everglades is a big, murky, mosquito-infested place, and while it has some of that, certainly, it's also one of the most biodiverse on the planet. So to be from my house to this spot takes me 3 hours. I want to be on site typically an hour, hour and a half before sunrise. So I got in the car at 2 a.m. to go do this. And then a little bit of a hike, not too much, a lot of wet feet involved in this because this is a what's called a wet prairie. So it's about, I'd say, ankle deep in water at this point.
Now, when you are shooting in conditions like that, you know, one of the things that's a bit of a challenge with landscape photography is actually finding a way to balance and protect the equipment. So are
Yes.
you using any rain guards here as you're tromping through water? How are you keeping your gear safe?
The big thing, I don't necessarily use rain guards in something like this unless it's really foggy to the point where it almost feels like a fine mist coming down. The big thing with any of these environments is really taking things slow. And this is where, you know, when I mentioned earlier about the importance of having your equipment on a tripod, that tripod serves a number of purposes. Number one, it separates you and your camera. Okay, so that in the event you get wobbly, you can set that tripod down and avoid knocking it over. But that tripod, that's going in front of me. So as I'm working my way slowly through this area, the tripod almost becomes a feeler that I am setting it down and then walking up to it. And then I set it down and I walk up to it. So it's a very slow process sometimes. And the general rule is, you know, when you're hiking and things like this, you never put your hands or feet where you can't see them. But here that can be a little difficult. So just taking things very slow, using the tripod as a feeler ahead of me to avoid getting stuck in holes or tripping over logs. That's some of the big issues here. One of the things that a lot of photographers, and I've been guilty of it myself, is that in foggy conditions like this, you've been driving, you know, hour, 2 hours or whatever, and you're like, oh my God, the light is beautiful. And you jump out of the car and your camera immediately fogs up. Okay. You want to make sure 10 to 15 minutes before you get on location, kick off the heater, kick off the AC. Do not take off your lens cap, but let that camera get to the same temperature as the outside. Okay.
Is there any benefit of keeping the camera gear in the trunk, or is that going to still be too warm?
It still will be too warm typically. And personally, I always keep my camera as close to me as possible in the car. I'm a big ready photographer disciple, so to speak. So I always ride around with my camera ready for whatever will give me the least amount of time to photograph it. Okay, so the camera stays on typically my 150 to 600 is typically on the camera as I'm driving somewhere because I figure wildlife's going to be the most fleeting. But with any of the lenses, I want to keep them up in the car with me, and that way I can sense, you know, and I can check to see if, you know, what the temperature is on them as I'm getting there.
Now, let's switch to another image, but this last one here that we saw, you know, now you're punching in on the action. What sort of focal length is being used here? You know, I think a lot of people mistakenly think that landscapes are only wider angle. You know, here you're still pretty punched in, and then on the next one, you're even tighter. What's the idea of storytelling here?
Well, and as an example, that this last one was shot with a 70 to 200, or actually 100 to 400 millimeter lens. This one was shot, I believe, with a 24 to 70, but closer to the 70 range. In this particular image, you're looking at a waterfall coming into basically a circular, almost sinkhole type canyon. So really the story to me was the sheerness of the rocks themselves, the water coming over the edge, and that kind of misty feel to it that we saw. If you look at something else like, let's say, this rainbow, again, this was let me jump off screen here. This was about 40 millimeters. So, you see a lot of those type of images that I'm not necessarily shooting at super wide, always in the, one of my favorite lenses is my 15 to 30, but just as often I'm using a 24 to 70 or a 70 to 200. Yeah. And this is, to go back to what I was saying a moment ago, this is an example of a long lens landscape. This was shot at about 300 millimeters. And the idea here was just picking out this one little patch of lilies here out in the middle of really a vast lake. But that's really what told the story of the morning, was these storm clouds rolling in, the still waters, the colors. So when you're thinking through your landscape photos, really think about what is telling story. What is it I love about this moment? What makes me want to press the button? What is going to tell that story to somebody else when they look at it? From a processing standpoint now, I want to take those same feelings and enhance them. Okay, particularly paying attention to the warm colors. And this is where it's very easy with landscapes to overdo it on color. We've all seen it a million times. Friends don't let friends HDR things to death. And you can see that happen where we slide it a little bit. Oh, that looks good. Oh, that looks good. Oh, that really looks good. And then you walk away and come back 5 minutes later and say, wow, was I on some kind of hallucinogen? That's way too colorful. So when I first look at this, is to make sure my colors are going to look good, that they're true to what I saw, and certainly erring a little on the side of fantasy. So for me, my first step is always going to be intelligent auto. I want to see what it produces first. Sometimes vivid's a little too much, but sometimes it looks great. And then from that intelligent auto, I'm going to come over and start working through my tones and say, okay, what does this image need to really make it sing, to really capture that moment? The first thing I see is
really folks realize, sorry for just 1 second, what that intelligent auto is doing is it evaluates every pixel in the image and then feeds back suggested values for color and tone. So it's a lot like what the camera would do. It just has the benefit of being able to take a little more time to analyze the scene before the exposure is taken.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Jason.
Okay. The first thing I'm seeing is I have a very dark band at the top and a very dark band on the bottom, which to me, those are slightly, they help frame to a degree, but they're too dark. And that's where coming in and looking at my exposure and specifically my black point to say, okay, where should my black pixels be? And in this case, just easing back that black point a little bit and opening up my exposure just a little bit will help start bringing in some of the detail in those areas. And you can already see that those are starting to look a little bit better. Typically, a little bit of light diffusion will work well in an image like this with these silhouettes, because what this is going to do is even out some of the contrast in those areas. Again, everything is about subtlety. You don't want to just jam every slider up to 100. That's the beauty of sliders, is you can start off at 100 and then just keep working back until you see what you like. With this, sometimes I will work with the colors. It just depends on the nature of the image. So in this case, I don't have any tints. That's one of the things I love about Perfectly Clear, is that it tells me if there's tint detected, because sometimes our eyes play tricks on us. We're looking at going, oh, that looks pretty good, but maybe something's off, and we don't realize it's a little too magenta, a little too green, that something is just not quite right.
And the key there is you do have different tint methods. So you're on maximum there, which is the most aggressive.
Yes.
But sometimes if it's too strong for you, there are more subtle methods to choose from if people need it.
And in this case, I don't really have to worry about it because there's no real tint issues. But you see, as I play around with the color restore, it's pulling back in those black tones that I didn't love in the first place. So I'm going to shy away from that and that's one of my key problem areas in my mind in this picture. Where I want people's focus to be is on the balance of the plants to the light and that nice tree line in the distance.
Excellent. Is there anything else you wanted to show with this photo? Because I apparently didn't actually share my screen correctly last time, and I want to.
Okay.
I'm gonna redo it while you queue up your next image. If
The only other thing I was going to build on was
yeah.
the idea of the graduated filter that you had already.
Yeah, go for it. Show it. Nobody saw it when I did it.
This is a perfect example of when graduated filter really does a great job at opening up some of these details and being able to come in here and open up some of those blacks and some of those the highlights in those areas really makes a huge difference. Now you can see that's way too much, but as I said before, start off high and then just start bringing things back until you get to that exact balance that you want. The other thing I do like about this is that in this case it got a little washed out. As I brought up that exposure, I can also tweak that color temp to make it just a little bit warmer so that I regain back some of that color. So to go from there to there with just that simple adjustment, and this is rough and quick. I would spend a little more time before I print it and hang it on the wall, but you can see it really very quickly makes those adjustments.
Very nice. Very nice. I'm going to attempt to share my screen really quickly here. Let me go ahead and choose present to everyone. So hopefully this is going to keep this screen up, and I will just screen share here really quick. There we go. Now let's reset this image here. Jason, can you go ahead and mute your mic for a second? We're getting just a little bit of feedback. There we go. And what I'm going to do is invoke Perfectly Clear version 3, and it's going to analyze the image. And to jumpstart things a little bit, there are actually some presets here called the Great Outdoors, and these are designed to make it a little bit easier. And you'll see some simple presets designed to let you dial in different lighting conditions. For example, I like this outdoor sunlight. It's a subtle adjustment, but it's really doing a nice job of cutting through some of that haze that's really prevalent. Now, I was in the desert, so there wasn't that much moisture, but just the afternoon glare, I'm of that ilk that while I'll get up early and shoot, I don't give up as soon as the sun gets into a bad position. A lot of times I find that throughout the day, the clouds change, and it's so easy after the fact to tweak some of this and to really get a great black point in depth. So even though the image was getting a little bit washed out in camera, I was able to bring a good deal of that back in post-production. Now, if you need it under pre-processing, there is a neutral density filter here, and it's not as good as the one that Jason mentioned of doing in camera, of course, but this is designed in post to help cut down on some of that glare. It could be useful on the skies there. It really cuts through some of that oversaturation that was kicking in if you need it. So that works really well, and I'm pretty happy there with tone. One of the other things that folks don't know about is fidelity, and this is an interesting adjustment that's designed for the greens in the landscape. So greens and purples will come through nicely, and this landscape doesn't have a lot of green, but you'll see that in the foreground there, it's really just helping nicely to bring some of that back. And then we'll finish that off, taking advantage of the graduated filter, and this makes it very easy to apply it. You simply place the center where you want it, and you can adjust this size here. And what this does is creates a blend. So you can see with no feather and no size, what we're getting is a simple top and bottom. But as we increase the feather here, it creates a blend between the two states. And if we want, we can even create an open area that's going to be unprocessed. So now the top of the sky is affected, the bottom of the ground is, but the middle of the mountain is left untouched. So this makes it easier to darken the top of the sky a little bit. What we'll do there is just pull the exposure down a little bit for the sky, and I can bump up the vibrancy of the sky. I'll just do a little color vibrance there to get a little bit richer sky. If you want, you can target that with a sky enhancer. And these are just recipes that are designed to bring out and emphasize different colors in the sky, including a sunrise or a sunset. And then on the bottom here, I can lift that area up a little bit to bring that out of the shadows, which I like, and then put a little bit more contrast in to get that. And that works quite well. The other thing that I would point out, besides making and saving your own presets, is the use of look technology. And these are lookup tables, and these are very easy to browse visually. So you'll see all sorts of film stocks that you can look at. And so I could apply something like a light film stock to that, and then just adjust the strength of that look to dial it in. And there's a whole bunch of other stocks in here. Our mutual friend, Vanelli, for example, has a pack that does a whole bunch of vintage photography looks, or the ability to do different types of black and white. And you can dial in the amount of the black and white transition, but this can really give you some nice quick looks on the image, and you can dial that in. I find that the use of some of the digital film stocks can be a nice subtle way to get what you want. And so I'll just go with a very simple popish film here and back that off. And you'll see there that that gives us a really quick shift that just gives it more of a filmic response. So that's my take, Jason.
Just a little bit more about me. I'm in Florida, and a lot of my photography is done down here. We're fortunate to have a huge amount of wildlife and scenic opportunities. And then over the past year, I've also been absorbing more adventure type photography into my particular portfolio, learning all the techniques to also capture people interacting with nature, because we see so much of that here as well. I really got started with birds. That was kind of what hooked me at first, and then that expanded to wildlife, and then that expanded to landscapes, and really now I just love anything to do with nature, and I'll take a photograph of anything that walks, crawls, swims, flies in front of my lens. I'm also a big believer that there's a three-step process that we have: finding the photo opportunity, which includes the creation part, the imagination part, the actual in the camera, and then the digital darkroom. And that while we create the photo in the camera, we finish it in the darkroom. And so the idea that we hear all these no words, manipulation and photoshopping and things like that. If you look at digital photography and understand what a raw file is, you have to process it. It is just raw information captured by the little computer that is in your camera. And if you don't process it, you haven't finished your photo. So I think that's a really important thing, that we need to not think of things like perfectly clear as bad things, that they're part of what helps us finish the photo. Switch over here. Okay, let's see. All right, can you see my peer picture here?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, so as an example of pre-visualization, to kind of go into what's happening in this particular scene. This is another sunrise shot. You'll get that impression I'm out early a lot, so anybody who comes and comes shoot with me, you will be up really early. I'm going to warn you now. And this is Reddington Pier. This is one of the old Florida classic wooden piers here on the Gulf Coast. And you can see how flat and calm the water is here. There's a lot of parts in Florida where you could walk out a mile and probably not get waist deep, and this is definitely one of them. This particular morning, I had been planning on this for months. This was the morning of a full moon, and we saw the supermoon that morning, and then this is after the moon had set. So I wanted to show this one in particular because on its surface it's kind of a flat picture, but there's really a lot of subtle color to it that you can really perk up nicely in as we're going through in perfectly clear. Now again, I tend to start with my intelligent auto just to see what it's going to do, but in this particular case, I'm going to lean a little bit more towards high contrast over the high def, just to see how it works between the two images. And what you'll see with the two is they're basically changed the way they're pulling out details in the shadows. In this case, I'm not quite as worried about pulling out details in the shadow under the pier. That's not a real high priority to me, but certainly pulling out a little bit more shadow, a little more detail in the waves, and really what's a big focal part of the image, which is that foreground, a really nice reflection that's right there in front of us. So as I'm working with these different sliders, that's, I'm always thinking, what is my final product? What is it I'm trying to tell here? In this case, this is a very serene scene. We've got a lot of pastel colors, which kind of reinforce that. Let's stick with that theme. I don't want to turn those waters into looking like a choppy, raging torrent. I want to have them look like the calm, serene place that it was. So anything I'm doing in terms of that is to enhance that mood and that feeling. It has picked up tint. You'll see that a lot of times with the sunrise shots because they naturally are tinted. In this particular case, I want to really keep the pink that's showing up here. So I may err on minimum when I'm looking at that. I certainly don't want to remove all of that. I just want to make sure that the color is correct for the scene. And as I'm going through there, then that's where I want to see that I'm still reinforcing that whole mood through that scene. You can see I have a booger on the frame there too. A little bit of a water spot.
That can happen when you're out roaming in the waves.
Exactly. Well, I will say that the reality was that up on top of here is a bait shop, and all of a sudden they flushed the bait coolers, which the pipe comes straight from the pier down to the people standing underneath of it if you are so unlucky to be there.
So you got fish guts getting the shot.
Yeah, I narrowly avoided having about 50 gallons of fish gut juice dumped on my head. That's the glamour of nature photography.
Well, Jason, I think this has done a nice job of showing folks some of the techniques that you use on landscape photography. Let's switch a little bit to nature photography for a moment.
Sure.
And obviously, landscapes can have nature in them. And, landscapes themselves are a type of nature photography, but you do a type of portraiture with animals being your subject. So talk about this, because this is a little bit harder than landscape photography, in my opinion, because landscape photography, you don't have to find the subject. You usually discover it, you drive to it, and it's there. But, just driving to the forest doesn't mean that you're going to encounter wildlife up close.
No, and wildlife photography involves having to be a lot of different kinds of ologist. You can't, it's not just knowing the photography side of things, how to work your camera, but you have to know how wildlife survives, what they do on a daily basis. Every animal has body language, every animal has cycles, and there's a pretty basic format for life on this planet of following a life cycle, and that they're going to reproduce, have young, those young are raised, or they grow up to create the next generation, and then the cycle repeats itself. However, within that basic cycle, there's almost infinite variation in it. And that's where part of the fun to me in wildlife photography is capturing all those little intimate moments that go into an animal's life. But to actually find and capture them, you have to be a good naturalist. That's number one. And to me, number two is that you really respect and love what you're taking pictures of. And when you do that, it shows in your work. So as an example, if I want to go and find certain types of birds, I need to know where they live, what time of year they're going to be here, what they like to eat. All those things are going to improve my odds. And it sounds bad, but being a professional wildlife photographer is a little bit like being a professional gambler sometimes. You don't know what you're going to run into. Certainly there is a little bit of luck involved, but the more you know about the animal, the more you improve your odds of finding them.
So as you're out and about and you're searching for animals, are there any things that improve your odds? You know, do you study time of day? Do you visit locations multiple times? What are you looking for so you can really find and engage your subject?
Yeah, what I'm looking for, there's number one is knowing where they're likely to live. Obviously, I'm not going to look for a polar bear in Florida outside of the zoo. They're just not going to live here. But, you know, more specifically, within Florida, different animals like different ecosystems. So, as an example, the picture I'm going to pull up next is a black-bellied whistling duck. Okay, black-bellied whistling ducks are primarily a freshwater species. Knowing that, I've just cut out half of the water that I can encounter in Florida, and I'm only going to focus on freshwater to find them. If it's during a dry period in the state, I know there's not a lot of surface water. This is a duck, it likes water, so I need to know where that water is. And then because it's a type of tree duck, they typically like to roost in trees. So I'm going to look for any kind of large body of fresh water that has a lot of dead trees around it, you know, waterlogged old snags, things like that, and that's going to massively improve my odds of finding a black-bellied whistling duck. The next part of that is migratory patterns, because most waterfowl migrates. So knowing at what time of year they're going to leave from what place they spend time in the summer to what place they spend time in the winter. We're fortunate they spend a lot of time here in Central Florida in the winter. So knowing those different things really helps me find them. The next part of it is not trying to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of people who study these animals, who know a tremendous amount about it, and you know, whatever your feelings may be on hunting or not, quite frankly, hunters have been studying these animals for millennia. And so picking up on a lot of the techniques that they use to find these animals, that's a lot of the same techniques that I would use as well.
Once we've found the subject, how do you integrate yourself into the scene so that you get the types of pictures that you want? I imagine that there's a lot of longer lens work here, both for your safety and the subject's comfort, but walk us through that process, and then let's take a look at a couple of images and how you enhance them.
Yeah, sure. Typically, it all comes back to the type of animal and the type of ecosystem that that I'm dealing with. And if you want, I can actually let me go ahead and share the screen I'm on at the moment so that they can see some of these animals I'm talking about, because some people may have never seen them before. And come on, it's thinking, maybe.
I see it. It's there.
Okay. So here I was talking about the black-bellied whistling duck. Beautiful duck. They're beautiful, great coloration, very animated. They squabble a lot amongst themselves. So I've done a bit of photography with them. That was a mule deer. So with any animal, the first thing I'm going to do is you have to determine whether this is an animal that you need to hide from to effectively photograph it, or whether it's one that you need to have accept your presence there. Ideally, what I want with every animal is for them to just ignore me, that they don't care that I'm there, they don't see me as a threat, they don't see me as food, they just ignore me. And so what I'm going to do with a bird like this is, I know he's out in the open, he sees me from a long ways away. Most of these animals have far better senses than we do. Yeah, and in this case, this bird knew that I was there. You know, unless I'm going to get into and set up a blind before sunrise and hunker down in it until they show up, they're going to see me from quite a ways away. So what I want to do with my behaviors and anything that I do in close vicinity to that bird is not come off as a predator. So one of the things is I don't walk straight at it locking eyes with it. I'm going to loop back and forth. So if I see that bird at say 100 yards away, I'm going to start walking and basically zigzagging back and forth, each zig getting a little bit closer. And then I may take a few frames just so it hears the camera going off. That process lets it decide whether I'm a predator or not. And a lot of animals will err on the side of caution, but they don't necessarily want to leave wherever they're at. They're typically there for a reason. They're either resting there, they're raising their family there, they're feeding there. So if that duck is in this spot, there's a reason it's there, and it probably doesn't want to leave.
Now, do you use the quiet shutter mode of your camera or silent shooting mode that many cameras support to minimize that noise?
It will depend on the animal. For some that are very sensitive to noise, certainly, and certainly if it's in a camera trap or something like that. But sometimes I actually want it to hear the noise, and once they hear that noise, realize that it's not a danger noise. Okay, so it's a little backward snaking, and I know there are those that will say, no, that's crazy talk, but that seems to work with me. And Florida birds are some of them are very tolerant. Ducks are a notoriously difficult species to photograph because they are hunted all along their flyways, so they associate people with danger in a lot of cases. So in this case, this particular bird, by doing that loop back and forth, not acting like a predator, not trying to hide, because that almost would seem more disturbing and more dangerous to this animal, it was very accepting of my presence to the point where I got very reasonably close that I could take full frame pictures. And this is at about 500 millimeters. Love my Tamron 150 to 600. That's one of my favorite lenses. I used to haul around a big prime. I don't do that as much anymore, partly for some health reasons, but partly because I just love the versatility of having a big zoom. So that if I go from photographing this duck, which is fairly small in the frame, to photographing the white-tailed deer that was standing on the edge of the bank 50 yards away, I have that versatility to zoom in or out.
Well, this is actually a good time. We have a question from one of the people watching the webinar, and they say, what is the minimal kit that you would bring with you? The photographer was honest, like many of us, and said, I often bring too much gear. So you mentioned one of your favorite lenses of having that versatility of range. Is there anything else that matters here that that are must-haves? I imagine you have to strike a balance of having what you need versus not having enough.
Yes. With all of this, I like to simplify. I used to be one of the guys who carried the entire B&H store on my back and, would try to walk out in the swamp with it, and it was just too much. So I tend to err on the side of having one body, one lens, and a backup lens depending on what I'm shooting at. If I'm specifically going for wildlife, then I'm going to simplify more. And I may give up opportunities to photograph a nice landscape because I want to have minimal gear to go out and photograph the wildlife that I'm encountering. So typically I'm going to go out with my camera body. Personally, I use a Canon 5D Mark IV. And I like the full frame. No, I don't use a crop. I know a lot of wildlife photographers that do, and that's fine. I don't disagree with that, but because I shoot a really broad range of nature, I like having that big full frame for my landscapes and being able to switch back and forth.
Any other equipment, such as, do you bring any blinds or safety gear or rain gear for yourself or anything to hide behind when you're shooting?
Yeah, typically I always go out with a day pack, no matter what I'm doing. And that day pack always has a liter of water in it. Number one, most important thing that we as nature photographers forget is to stay hydrated. I always make sure I have a full extra set of batteries, extra memory cards, always have rain gear in the bag for the camera. I use a storm jacket, and I use the largest size so that it can adapt down because they do collapse nicely. And I always have a small first aid kit and a headlamp in my bag. I'm a big believer in being prepared. I'm actually a wilderness first aid trained, as well as Florida Master Naturalist. So those things help keep me safe and also help keep the people I take out safe as well. So in terms of gear, you know, I go pretty minimal on my camera equipment for something like this because I know that I'm going to want long lenses, the camera, the memory cards, but then certainly having some extra safety equipment as well, just to stay safe out there.
Jason, why don't you go ahead and open up one more picture for editing in perfectly clear so we can give
Sure.
folks a couple more tips. And thank you guys who have joined us. We'll stitch the two parts of the video together so everyone can see both sides. And I see you got a great photo there that we're going to take a look at here in a moment. One of the things that I think is an important step that I imagine you'll talk about is that sharpening is a nice way to bring out some of these details too.
Yes.
As we work with the subject. So that's one of the things that I like about Perfectly Clear is that it does do a nice job of bringing out some of those details. So I see here, you know, you've opened up an image, Jason, and looks like you're going to bring up your screen here in just a second. You stop sharing your screen there for a second. If you can bring it back. Perfect. Awesome. So you're obviously at a longer lens length here because you're really filling the frame, but I love how the background has gone soft. We see nothing here about the subject other than the subject itself. So what sort of focal length and aperture are you at here for these types of shots?
Typically
so low to the ground.
As a nature photographer, get used to being on your belly or on your knees. That is one of the things. Eye contact is key in this kind of photography, and the smaller the critter, the lower you have to go. That's the general rule of thumb. So in the case of this squirrel, who is the happiest creature I've ever photographed, I think he's just ecstatic with that acorn. In this case, I'm laying on my belly, and you can use a couple different things, either just laying on your stomach and hand holding, or using something like the platypod as a ground support that you can slide in front of you. It really depends what your preference is. I don't necessarily only go one method. Sometimes I will be just hand holding. Sometimes I'll be on a ground pod, so it varies quite a bit. For settings then, by getting this low, what will happen is the background behind your subject is a lot further away. So what you're seeing is that your depth of field is only including the squirrel in this case, and I'm putting my focus right on the eyes. Okay, typically somewhere in the f5.6 to f8 range. That's, you know, one of the old sayings, the, you know, f8 and forget it. It's pretty good for wildlife, but I really like to compose that background first. So by composing the background first, you can then throw that out of focus, find something that's very pleasing to your subject and isn't competing with it. So little movements left, right, up, and down to get that background so that it's really complementary to the subject. And that's where I tend to shoot aperture priority, because I really still want to control that depth of field, which other modes wouldn't allow me to do if I was on shutter priority. I tend not to shoot manual with wildlife a lot just because of changing light conditions. Sometimes your eyes will adapt and you don't realize the light has changed. So if you were shooting on manual, all of a sudden you can end up with a dark frame. Whereas with aperture priority, I'm trusting the camera to make some choices for me, but then I can override it using my exposure compensation.
That makes sense. So what sort of enhancements are you going to do to an image like this to really bring out the subject?
Well, in an image like this, what I really want to focus on is, you know, the focus point of this image, if, you know, again, we're talking the story, is that we have a very happy little squirrel with a nut, in this case, a live oak acorn. And so any enhancements I'm going to do is, as you mentioned, was to focus really on the sharpening aspect, because we have this really wonderful texture in the fur. I mean, it feels like you could almost just, feel how soft he is right now. And the other part of this enhancement is to make sure that that background stays complementary. And I may even add a slight vignette to it instead of removing. Sometimes we think of vignettes as a bad thing, but a very subtle vignette can really enhance the focus on your subject. And in this case, that vignette, by darkening the corner slightly, would actually place more focus on the squirrel's face here. So you can see that fur particularly, and I think I may actually be close enough that I could see my own reflection in that eyeball if I looked in there.
Yeah.
At this point, I'm probably about 8 feet away, laying on the ground, and I'm letting the squirrel come to me. I'm not trying to force myself in closer, letting the animal decide what their personal space is, so to speak. You'll end up with better results, and the animals will be much more cooperative when you're shooting with them.
And when you do sharpen, Jason, do me a favor, punch into 100% on the magnification. It's really important
Sure.
so you can accurately judge what's happening. A lot of folks sharpen, but they don't realize that if they're not at 100%, you
Right.
can't really tell what's happening on the frame. So pull back just a little bit. It looks like you're at 125. And if you click those plus and minus buttons in the upper left corner, that'll jump set increments there. So that's an easy way to get right to 100. Now, every single pixel you're seeing is exactly what's going to be output. So there's no surprises. If you sharpen and you're not at 100%, sometimes you have a tendency to over sharpen.
And the other thing here with sharpening too is that you'll notice noise has been detected. You have to walk a very fine line on your noise removal, because you don't want to remove too much noise and result in a loss of detail in that fur. You're not really going to see noise in the fur. It's more in these areas that it's going to be as obvious. So, but I don't want to make this super soft in that area. Perfectly Clear does a nice job at differentiating the two between sharpening and noise removal, but still just keep that in mind that you want to be careful not to end up making this area blurry.
And there are 3 different types of noise reduction. Actually, I think 5 if you click on that. So you're using the default method there, but you do have a couple of others that are more or less aggressive depending upon what you need.
Yeah, and with wildlife, I tend to err on the side of less aggressive, unless it's a very high ISO shot with a lot of noise in it.
Well, that's looking great. I love just how that fur texture, those
detailed that is. And that's what I, again, just slide it up a little bit, see how it looks. You don't want it to look, shall we say, crunchy, I guess is the best way to put it. So typically with something like this, I'm going to be somewhere in the 80 to 100 range. I find works pretty well. And you can see all that detail. I mean, those little claws, how detailed he really is. Okay.
Excellent. And why don't you go ahead and finish that off with a little bit of a vignette? So to jumpstart that, you'll find presets up at the top there that are kind of a nice simple way. And so the light portrait one is my favorite starting point. It's more subtle, but there are others in there that are more aggressive if you need them. And that's nice. That's just really pulling the focus to the subject by darkening the edges.
I'm just going to pull that up just a little bit. And depending on the nature of it, you can certainly change the shape. In this case, he's a little more upright. So I'm going to pull that in just a little bit versus this, which isn't going to quite work for his shape. So really look, every animal has body geometry. And that's also part of what has set my composition in this particular case. Because he's standing upright and I'm fairly close, I'm going to go with more of a vertical shot. As he turned and started to walk away, I'm probably going to flip to a more of a landscape. And so certainly with your vignette, keep that in mind as well.
Very nice. Very nice. Well, Jason, these have been some great tips. I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Absolutely.
You do also lead workshops and you regularly write articles. So where are some places people can go to keep learning from you, to get some new ideas? And if they also want to learn about some of your workshops, where can they find out about those?
Yeah, certainly. Well, first off, any of my articles are available on photofocus.com. And I regularly write about things such as this, wildlife, landscapes, and post-processing as well. If you'd like to see my photography, go to on Instagram at Nature Photographer Jason. I'm on there pretty regularly. And you can go to my own personal website, www.naturphotography.com.
Great, great. Well, Jason, I'd really like to thank you for joining us today, and I hope the folks that joined us live really got some new ideas and techniques, or if you're watching the replay, thanks for tuning in as well. Remember, you can download a free copy of Perfectly Clear to really try it out. You can run that on a 21-day trial to really see how it works for you. I would suggest that you try out the Essentials version if you're a nature and landscape photographer. If you are going to be doing a lot of portrait photography, you might enjoy the full bundle as well. And besides that, even after it expires, some of the cool technology in it will keep working in their free version, so you can give that a shot and see if that helps you out. Jason, thanks again for joining us and sharing some of your techniques. My name is Rich Harrington, and I appreciate those of you who came out and joined us live today, or if you're watching the replay. Thanks again.
Thanks all.